Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today on the Egora Experience program. I am your host, Cesare Jurevich. Today I have with me Javier Javier from the great nation of USA. Now, Javier is an entrepreneur and the host of the Javier Javier show on YouTube. Um, I'm really happy to have you here. Please tell us a few more words about yourself.
Well, I'm happy to be here, Cesare. I am Javier Javier, the host and creator of the Javier Javier Show. Make sure you say it twice on YouTube. And I basically talk politics, religion, and culture. That's kind of my stick. So I'm more of a commentary kind of guy instead of like a hardcore into the weeds about politics. I just kind of basically, give my commentary on a lot of issues. So with that being said, I'm glad you invited me on, and I'm really excited about having these discussions about these ideas.
Fantastic. It's going to be awesome to engage you in these discussions. Now, for those of you who are new to the Egora Experience, let me tell you real quick about what we do here. The International Logic Party has built a new kind of networking platform. It's called Egora, and it actually makes politics rational, efficient, and incorruptible. Um, this thing actually gives ordinary citizens like us real political power. Through Egora, we can make our governments do what we, the people, want them to do. Now, on this show, we will be using Agora to discuss some political issues and ideas that each one of us supports. And we want you to participate with us. So please register for Agora. The link is in the video description. Then search for both me and my guest, Javier Javier. And then, as we are having our discussion, if you agree with our ideas, you will be able to support them by including them into your ideological profile in Agora. Here, your voice has real power, and we want to hear you speak. Okay, Javier, let's get started. We're going to discuss two ideas in the Agora, one from me and one from you. I will go first to kick us off.
All
So,
right.
this is really my most important practical idea. It's a very brief idea, so we'll have a quick read through of it. The most fundamental component of reducing overall violence and suffering in the world is to ensure freedom from captivity for all animals, including humans. To achieve this goal, no one should be allowed to hold captive any other animal, especially to breed them or to harm them at a later time. Now, in this idea, there are actually two links that are provided. We're not going to be able to display that now, but for anybody who it's to provide a little bit of resources. One of those is a video that just shows a lot of animal abuse in factory farms and how animals are treated in the food production industry. And the other link is to Anonymous for the Voiceless website, which shows all of the animals that are being killed really by the second. So it's just astronomical numbers. Like as soon as you click on this website, like the numbers just start blowing up. How many animals are being murdered for food? So that's just as a resource for people to get a picture of the gravity or the size, the scope of the situation. Anyway, so that's the idea. What do you think about this idea? Will you support it?
I got a few issues with that idea. Uh, for one, why is it that it's okay for other animals to kill other animals, but it's not okay for humans to kill other animals?
Well, I mean, it's not. We're not talking about killing animals. We're talking about enslaving them for keeping them captive. That's the first thing. So the difference is that those animals, they're not keeping those animals captive. They actually, like a lion hunting a gazelle, it's not keeping it in a pen, feeding it and you know, uh, actually artificially inseminating it, the other animals so that their numbers grow to inflate their numbers so that they can murder them later when they feel like it. So they actually allow freedom to those other animals. Humans are That's what actually humans do. They hold animals captive so they can increase their numbers so they have more animals to murder later. Um, I don't know. I want to hear what you think about that. We can
Yeah,
come back to the other.
yeah, I was because I want. All right, this is how I view it. I don't see another alternative on how to feed massive populations of people if you don't hold the animals captive and actually increase the amount that they repopulate and the size of the animals. Um, some people say that we could go to plants, and you also have to bring in the idea of, global warming and how much these factory farms actually produce and contribute to global warming. But also, I don't see an alternative to feeding mass populations of people. So I have a hard time accepting that idea, is because, for one, human beings, for the most part, enjoy eating animals. And I don't see how you're going to force most of the human population to stop eating animals. And if they're going to eat animals, then it's only natural for them to keep and hold animals in order to try to produce as much as they can in order to feed as many people as possible.
Um, there were a few points I wanted to make. I should have been taking notes. So first of all, like as far as food production and actually have enough food to feed people, the meat and dairy and all those animal industries, they're actually very inefficient as far as feeding people. Like if people were eating the produce straight, from the farms rather than the, like grains and soybeans and everything that they feed to the animals, we would be able to feed a lot more people. Like it's only like 25% efficient, to actually convert vegetables into meat and then feed it to the people, as opposed to people eating the produce directly. So that's like about 4 times more efficient, 4 or 5 times. It's tremendously wasteful as far as energy, as far as land resources. Um, so you can definitely feed more people, but again, the opening clause of this idea, it starts out with the most fundamental component of reducing overall violence and suffering in the world. Like that's the goal, and assuming that that is your priority as opposed to your own personal pleasure of what you get to eat. It's kind of violence and suffering versus do I get this temporary pleasure. I think a lot of people kind of relates to the fact that kind of the violence and suffering is a little bit higher of a concern than whether I get to eat exactly what I want. Not to mention that there are fantastic, non-animal substitutes.
Alternatives.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I've tried a lot of alternatives. Beyond Meat burgers are pretty decent. What I would say is, I don't think most people care about the suffering and violence done to animals. You would have to be able to convince people to care. I don't think most people care, and honestly, most people don't want to know about the suffering of the animals. People would rather just get their hamburger. Now, I understand that you want to reduce violence and suffering, but I don't think people care about the suffering of animals. I mean, would you go out in the wild and stop, a lion from eating a gazelle? Would you? I mean, I know that they're not being farmed, but I'm pretty sure that gazelle is going through a lot of pain and suffering as that animal eats it from the very back and work its way up to the front as it slowly dies. I mean, would you be willing to go out there and put an end to that also?
Well, in nature achieves an equilibrium. There are so many animals that can graze off the land, and then there are so many predators that can survive by eating that. And essentially, anytime that you allow freedom within an environment, that's what happens. There will be predators that evolve that eat the other animals, but there is an equilibrium. And the point of this is to say that actually humans artificially change that equilibrium by growing food just to feed those animals so they can murder them. They change the equilibrium of how many animals are actually being murdered. So there would be a lot less violence and suffering in the world if humans were not doing that.
Can I
Um,
ask you this? Can I jump in on that point? How do you know that humans doing what they're doing is not a part of the equilibrium? Because we evolved and we became this way. We're a part of the food chain just as much as any of those other animals. How do you know humans are not just doing what humans do based on evolutionary, the way evolution actually unfolded? Maybe we turn out this way for a reason, and we just haven't been able to quantify it yet.
Um, I would say that we would actually have to do some calculations exactly of the numbers. But as far as like, like if you look at there are some, I don't have the numbers with me exactly, but if you look at the biomass, there are certain interesting measurements about how much of the animals by weight, by mass on the planet are actually like what there are interesting estimates about that. And the point is to say that there are so many more animals because of humans actually breeding them, that the biomass of animals has increased. So there is a lot more death, there is a lot more suffering because humans are creating that extra life
So
to be.
what happens? What happens if we release those animals out into the wild? All the animals and the extra life that we created in factory farms. Because you have to explain how we best get rid of the factory farming. Do we just let all the animals run off into the wild? That also sets out the equilibrium. If not, much more, much more than actually just keeping them in the farm and finishing off the herd, I guess, in a way, before releasing them off into the wild.
Well, a retirement package. I think all those animals are owed a nice retirement package in a what do you call them, sanctuaries and stuff like that. So yeah, there would be a lot of animals who would have to be, let's say, phased out. They would live their lives until they die off. That generation dies off, but then they don't have the offspring, so that yeah. So a lot of basically cows would actually disappear according to this idea, because cows don't exist in nature. They're like through selective breeding, they were created by humans. So are chickens. I mean, the way that actually, if you look at the original ancestors of chickens in the wild, they're a very different bird. They're smaller. They lay eggs only like 12 times a year instead of like 360 times. Uh, that's where the selective breeding is. So these animals have, deficiencies of calcium in their bodies. Their bones are weak and brittle because humans have bred them so that, yeah, so that they produce more eggs, and which takes a toll on their own bodies. So, uh, and but to your point, that's
but
what I forgot to
yeah.
comment on. You were talking about that people don't care, and I think people do care, especially when they see these videos. That's why this idea has that link included, because it's to make it convenient for somebody to actually look and see that, and people are affected by it, so people do care. It's just that people avoid it because they want to live in an illusion. They don't want to be faced with the harsh reality of things. But then again, there are other people who want to confront people with that reality, such as myself. So, and,
I've seen those videos. I've seen those videos plenty of times, and to be honest, they never really phased me as much. Like, I'm not upset when I see a lion eat a gazelle. To me, that's part of nature. Humans evolved, and we somehow started farming. To me, it's just as much as part of nature as anything else. I don't think human beings are outside of nature. Everything we do is because evolution allows us to do it. And we're still in that pyramid of, the predator versus prey situation. Now, I do get your point as far as increasing suffering, but I see humans farming animals the same way that I would see a lion not choosing to eat leaves because he would prefer to eat a gazelle because it's more delicious. It's what he evolved to do. Humans have evolved. We enjoy the taste of meat for a reason. And from what I understand is if it wasn't for eating meat, we may not have evolved to the point that we are now.
well, so I just want to clarify, this idea is not about not eating animals. I think that if some humans want to eat animals, they should go out into the wild and hunt them. That's their fundamental. I think, and I commented on that. In your Facebook group, you made or somebody there was a conversation going on, and I said, the most basic right that people have is to kill. That's your most fundamental right, because if anybody tries to take away any of your rights, well, you can always try to kill them,
Yeah.
to defend your other rights. And so yeah, a lion has the right to kill if it feels it needs to survive, it needs to, or whatever. It can go and hunt the gazelle and eat it, right? And so if you want to go and hunt some other animals, then that's your fundamental right. Now, if you take things in the context of the wild, then maybe other people have the right to hunt you for hunting those other animals. But that's another story.
Yeah.
Uh, but that's if you really want to look at the real extension of the right. So if you want to do that, go ahead. Um, but again, we're talking about this whole industry of inflating the supply of life. The essence of this idea is minimizing violence and suffering. It's not saying to eliminate it completely. If you wanted to eliminate violence and suffering, you would actually have to just incinerate the whole planet and turning into Venus. Basically, maybe the greenhouse gas effect might actually turn Earth into Venus and actually will end the suffering of all life because all life will stop. No, this idea is about minimizing it, reaching that lowest equilibrium point.
So let me ask you this: would you be for if scientists found a way to turn off the nervous system of these animals where they could not feel pain? Would you be okay with them continuing to factory farm all these animals and produce them in large numbers and inflate them? Would you be willing to, because that decreases suffering? Because you can't suffer if you can't feel pain.
you're, you're really trying to. Well, first of all, I don't. How are they going to develop that? That sounds like they would have to do some animal experimentation, and
there, there, there
I'm
are
an
humans
opponent.
who don't feel pain.
I'm an opponent to of animal experimentation. So I mean, if you want to experiment on some willing old people who want to donate their bodies to science to deactivate their, um, I think fear is a conscious. That's I would some time to think about this. Um,
Because there are people who don't feel pain. They are born with a defect that they can't actually, like, if you pinch them, they can't feel it, and they even bite themselves because they can't feel the pain. So if something happens to them, they won't even know it happened. So I mean, scientists, as we know, are very, very resourceful, and they can find a way to turn off that little switch in the brain, by pain, and then you would be perfectly fine with it because it minimizes suffering. And that's the whole idea of that's the whole concept of your idea.
well, I mean, but then you could do that to everybody. I mean, you could do that to humans. So you really, what it comes down to is it's politics. Actually, this is really ultimately a political idea, because if some people start doing that, then why not doing that to some of the voters? Why not start doing that to certain people? Hey, what's the problem? They don't feel pain, they don't feel suffering. I mean, the other aspect is fear. So we didn't quite address that. I don't know if people who don't feel pain, if they also don't feel fear on top of that. That's kind of a maybe.
Well, I mean, I can't say for certain, but I'm under the impression that if I put my hand on the stove and I burn myself, then I'm afraid of the pain that it caused, and therefore it reinforces in my mind that I don't want to put my hand on the stove. But if I put my hand on the stove and I don't feel it, I don't know to be afraid of that pain. Somebody would have to tell me, "Hey, you don't do that because of X, Y, and Z." But I don't fear it because I don't understand. I don't associate it with pain.
I mean, fear of death. Fear of death. That's what I'm talking about. Like, do people who do not feel pain, do they still have a will to live and an aversion to danger? Let's say.
Uh, Not exactly. Like I said, the humans that are born with this defect, they actually harm themselves. They actually bite themselves and actually cause pain, well, cause harm to themselves because they can't feel it. They don't know any better. They don't know to avoid those behaviors. So, not really.
but does that mean that they, play Russian roulette let's try to shoot
Uh,
myself and see?
well,
Like,
I mean, of course not, because people are not going to allow them to do that. I mean, even the parents of these children try to stop them from biting themselves. But I'm sure if you left to their own devices, I'm pretty sure they would end up killing themselves. You know.
yeah, well, but okay, so I mean that's something to be considered. I mean, I look at fear as fear of death and whether they still want to live. If somebody threatened them that, hey, I'm going to kill you, even though you don't feel any pain, they would still probably like try to preserve their life. They would still want to stay alive. So that, it's that instinct to live, the desire to live, fear of death. I would expect them to have that. So now, if we could turn both of that off, both the pain as well as fear, that complicates the issue. But then again, we're talking about people who do that. Are these people that we can trust? And it's because ultimately, when you the way that I see ethics, it's ultimately it's not just about how one person treats others, because if a person can come up with a way to mistreat others, then they are probably eventually also going to come up with a way to mistreat you. Kind of like people came up with an argument to mistreat animals. Well, eventually they found an argument to mistreat other humans as well. Because they're just animals too. So why not do these things to other humans? So it's really dangerous territory.
So let me ask you this, because I heard the argument that humans may decide to cut off pain or their emotions at certain points. Let's say you lose a child and the pain is so immeasurable and you can't function. There may be scientifically one day a pill that you can take and it'll numb all that for a certain period of time. People may choose this in the future. Um, like all things, it's subjective. But I'll support your idea if you can admit that because you said it was about suffering. You didn't say it was about fear. You didn't say it was about the fear of death. You said it was about pain and suffering. That's why I
It's
proposed what I
suffering. It
did.
actually, just correction. It just says suffering. It does not. It says violence and suffering. Technically, it says violence and suffering.
Okay. So, okay. So if you can accept the fact that if we could get rid of the suffering, you wouldn't have such a problem with this idea. I'll accept your idea because I do think overall it's a good idea to relieve pain and suffering, or I mean, to relieve violence and suffering where possible.
Um, yeah, it's. I'm gonna, you know what? I mean, the way that we work with these ideas, it's not supposed to be like a contract. Like, I'll do this for you if you do this. If you do this for me. I mean, it might come down to like, what is the common interpretation of that idea? What do we interpret this idea to mean? I could mean this. I could interpret this idea to mean one thing. Someone else could interpret this to mean something slightly different. Um, so there is room for interpretation, but ultimately it should be, if the idea works for you, then it works for me. But I definitely want to think about what you raised. So I'm definitely going to be considering how that plays into it. But I'd say that the other part is violence. It's really and it's about minimizing those relationships of power and oppression, of using power to oppress. Because, like I said, yeah, you might minimize suffering, but it's still it. I mean, another way to put it is if you can grow, like test tube meat. That's a simpler way of putting it. Why not just, instead of growing animals that don't feel fear or pain, there are people just trying to grow muscle tissue, and so that's kind of simpler. And so how would you treat that?
I'm
And
I'm I'm for that as long as it's cost effective. I think that's where they are in the process, but it's getting cheaper and cheaper as they develop it more and more. So I really think we're heading into the future for that. I think with your idea is you tied, animal liberation with, relieving suffering, when I think you're taking a humanist approach about relieving violence and suffering. I think that should be a separate idea from animal liberation, because those two things don't have to be tied, because I can ask you about violence and suffering right now. Are you okay with boxers boxing? Are you okay with UFC fighters? Because they're causing violence and suffering upon each other for money. Would you be for getting rid of those sports, that could, play into that violent suffering thing?
You know what, I wouldn't actually call that violence. It's, it's a different form of competition. It's within a certain confine. They know that they're not going to get killed as a result. I mean, by accident they might, but it isn't.
Yeah,
Uh,
it has happened. I mean, well, if you watch boxing, you can tell these guys pump it up a lot. I'm gonna go in here. I'm gonna destroy this guy. I'm gonna beat you so bad. I'm gonna, you know, there's an element of threat there. There's an element of fear there. To overcome your fear when you're about to get in the ring and literally try to punch somebody down to the ground. I mean, it's a very high intensity. All those same natural feelings you're feeling when you get in a fist fight out in the streets, 10 times more, because all eyes are on you. So that could
it's
be included in your idea.
it's also showmanship. That's the other thing. A lot of that is a show for the people who are watching that, to kind of get them in that mentality. I don't know if these people really feel that same experiences of fear that people would in the street. I mean, yeah, it's a real danger. They could get knocked out. They could die, but I think they do that. It's been pretty well tested over time that most likely they're not going to die as a result of a boxing match, and so they just accept that as a risk, just like a coal miner goes into the mine, knowing that maybe they will get crushed to death and suffocated, but it's part of the risk of the sports of the job. Um, but the point about test tube meat, so yeah, I am a supporter of that. I mean, I don't actually, I would not eat test tube meat myself. I think I find that ethically problematic for other reasons. I do, if that minimizes suffering of animals, then yeah, I do support it, even though I myself am repulsed by it. And so I don't know if that gives you clarification on the question of minimizing pain.
Yeah, I just think it's two separate ideas that you join together, because I'm for minimizing suffering and violence, but then you have to also accept the idea of being against animal captivity, which I don't think those things are necessarily tied. And I just think that I could accept one idea without accepting the whole idea. Does that make sense?
Well, my point was to make that connection. Like, if people were not keeping animals captive, there would be a lot less animals being. There would simply be a lot less animals in the world. Like, so I wish I had that statistic because yeah, if you look at the amount of I think the statistic was about how much like animal life is under human control versus what's in the wild, and like it's like 95% of all the animal life or something. That's like if you add up all the cows by weight and add up all the chickens by weight, add up all the pigs by weight, it would be like, well, I mean, I don't know. They're not really counting whales in the ocean. Oh, I think they were only counting that on land, and maybe they're probably not counting all the insects. But if you look at that, if you look at the numbers of animals, I mean, see, it's really like 60, if not somewhere close to 100 billion animals a year that are being murdered by humans for food. Like, and that's the animal counter. Those numbers would not exist. Like, it would be a lot lower if it was just animals in the wild. Um, so I do think there's very much a connection there. Anyways, we're really kind of at a up to a half an hour here. We could wrap this up and maybe revisit thinking about this. I don't know if you still want to support this idea. You can think about it. We could always talk about it off camera. I don't want to keep this going too long. We do have some time constraints. Any other thoughts that you wanted, any other comments on this idea before we wrap up round one?
Yeah, there are a few elements that I support in your idea. I think we just have to kind of break it down. I know that you're selling the whole. I know that your whole idea is one as a whole. So we'll talk more about the idea, and once we get into the weeds, maybe I'll be more willing to accept the idea. Uh, Other than that, I appreciate you having me on. I look forward to doing part two. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So right now we're at the halfway point of our program. We're going to take a break here and come back to discuss Javier's idea in a moment in round two. So see you soon.